I'm pleased to open tonight a series of conversations with international curators in correlation with our current exhibition Black Box, opened a month ago. I'm happy to see all of you and wanted to point out we will have time in the end for a few questions. The exhibition Black Box outlined the formation and change of human and non-human relations. A story that portrays a flexible and semi-imaginary time sequence. To extend and elaborate on the story, we invited three curators that are operating in the visual culture sphere and live in different parts of the world. During the conversation, I will present images from the exhibition in an effort to try and understand if our theory that people from diverse cultural, professional, and social background connect and relate to the objects and artifacts around us differently. I'm extremely honored that my first guest is Glenn Adamson. Adamson is a curator, writer, and historian based in New York. He has previously been director of the Museum of Art and Design, head of research at the V&A, and curator at the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. The articles and the many books he wrote are an amazing source of inspiration and thoughts about craft, materiality, and the relationship between people and objects. Hello, Glenn. I'm very glad to host you tonight.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you, Maya.
It's noontime around. Is it afternoon?
It's afternoon. It's 2 o'clock here on the East Coast in America, yes.
Okay. But before we dive in, I would like to share with you a story I read in Fewer Better Things, one of your books. It is a story about a 13-year-old girl, your great-aunt Gail, who grew up in a farm during the Great Depression. One day, she was hired to mind the neighbor's farm for a week and had to deal with a minor problem. The pig died. And she knew that the pig is the family's winter supply. She couldn't call for help, obviously, so she skinned the pig, cut it into pot-sized chunks, cooked it on the wood stove, washed and sterilized 20 jars, cut and packed the meat in the jars, cooked it in a pressure cooker, let the jar cool and moved them to the cellar. Only then, you write, she washed up and went to bed. After I read the story, I kept looking at children around me, especially in my family, asking myself what would they do in a similar situation. And I thought that they would probably ask Google. That's what I will do. What do you think, Glenn? What would they do?
Yeah, you're right. They would ask Google. If they were enterprising, they would ask Google. And the question is, would Google be able to help? I think that's a perfect way of putting it, because obviously the point of the story is not how amazing my 13-year-old great aunt was. And my grandfather, who told that story all the time, used to call that his useless little sister story, because of course that's how he thought of her. But it was obviously a remarkable thing that she did, but the point of it is how much we have lost in the 100 years since that time. Because of course, if you look at a 13-year-old or even look at yourself, I wouldn't be able to butcher and pressure can a pig. Not even close. I don't think the prospect would even occur to me. And so it just shows you how far we've come in such a short time in the domain of what I call material intelligence, which is to say, having a very strong understanding of the material world around you, being able to manipulate it, having some sense of contact with it and its principles. So that's the point of the story, I guess.
Yeah, but well, it's a great story. And it brings me to the exhibition, because our exhibition is dealing with objects and the relationship between objects and human beings. And I will start sharing the screen now. We start with the first image. As I said, I'm going to show you images and to ask you to relate to those images. My first image is a handheld stone created 500,000 years ago. That's the original stone that we got from a museum. In our exhibition, this is the first step in the investigation of the relationship of humans and objects, the intimate encounter between humans and materials. But we have another project in the exhibition, which is Amidrach and Dov Ganshro stones. It's more contemporary, as you can see. When I told you that I'm going to show images in our talk, you asked me to show those images of the stone. You wanted to relate to them. So I wonder, what do you see when you look at the stone?
Yeah, this is such a fascinating project. And there's a lot you could say about it. Partly just the collision of time. I mean, even the title, contemporary prehistoric. So taking the two extremities of human presence on the earth and bringing them together in a single set of objects. So that's already fascinating. But I guess what it made me think about is the relationship between tooling systems and human capability. And the first thing you think of when you think about a contemporary prehistoric hand axe is a kind of dystopian scenario or an image of complete collapse of society, such that we would be reduced to the most basic technology again, the most archaic, the first technology, if you like, which is what those hand axes represent to us. And then the second thought that occurred to me is that even in that dystopian scenario, when you're confronted with the hand axe as an object, it might occur to you how very amazing that thing is, because already those first tools represent who knows how many centuries or indeed millennia of accumulated knowledge to get to the point of even being able to make those first hand axes. And I've talked to archaeologists who have tried to make hand axes according to the chipping method that we've reconstructed as the means by which those were created. And it's incredibly difficult, incredibly skilled. And it really is something that takes years to learn to do it properly. Think about getting a large hand axe completely symmetrical and usable in the hand. So it's a very moving thing to be confronted with those early hand axes, because they suggest that there's something intrinsic to the human condition that's not just about us as tool users, but also about us as being skilled in ways that before you get the skill, you could never have imagined. So there's this kind of trajectory of self-training and learning and discovery that literally carries us beyond ourselves, beyond some horizon of possibility that we might otherwise perceive in ourselves. And I think anybody who's learned a skill, whether it's making or music or athletics, really any kind of advanced skill, will have some sense of what that is, to have an embodied experience of transforming yourself to attain a new ability. And maybe the thought would be to understand human history at large as being something like that as a species, we've been able to continually transcend our previous limitations. And that's really what it seems to me your exhibition is about. So it couldn't be a better object to start with.
Mm-hmm. The stone we saw was created as a direct extension of the human body. We can see the same intimacy, because one of the subjects we were talking about in the exhibition was the intimacy between objects and human beings. And we can see the same intimacy in other objects created by mankind. And when we look at the model telephone you see here, that was designed to fit to the human pulp. And even in this project that is in our exhibition by Studio Gili Kuchik and Rana Mitai for Stratasys, this amazing project, you see that it is designed as pebbles. And but what I keep on wondering is what happens to us when we look at something like that, at the Bereshit lunar launcher. What happens to our intimacy when we approach a black box like the launcher? Do we feel the same intimacy, or is it a new form of intimacy that we're feeling towards these objects?
Yeah, I have a pretty high degree of confidence in people's ability to form new means of intimacy, as you just said. And the fact that we do personify or see the animation in technology is a good example of that. I mean, maybe for a lot of people, certainly for me, this looks a lot like an animal, and in fact, it seems almost to be based on an animal in some ways. Like, look at the construction of the legs; they look like my dog's legs or the legs of a horse. So maybe that suggests that humans aren't so good at coming up with solutions that nature hasn't already prototyped for us, which I guess is one thought. But stepping back from the specifics of the launcher and thinking about whether we can have affection for it, let's say, as respect is different from affection, I think. So there's a really interesting question there about black box technology in general. Um, I think it might be worth noticing, and I was thinking about this when you showed the phones a couple of images ago, that the real constraint on technology now is really the human body, if you think about it. Because of course, the functionality that we associate with our smartphones could be made much, much smaller. And the reason it's the size that it is because we wouldn't be able to handle it anymore. We wouldn't be able to physically manipulate it or see it. And so you're in this now very interesting situation with technology where one of the main parameters
Sorry.
where one of the main parameters is actually the scale and the specific physical features and affordances of our hands, of our whole bodies. And so in a funny way, although I'm much given to casting doubt on smartphones as a technology to beat them all and a replacement for all of these other tools that we used to have, I think that we lose a lot in that process as well. Sort of the story about the pig is a good indication of that. But on the other hand, you might think about whether the fact that technology is more and more getting, but I just think it's interesting to think about the fact that if the human body is now the most active constraint on our technology, our ability to interact with it, maybe that's actually a pathway to a different kind of intimacy, because it's reflecting us in a different way. It's almost like the technology is being molded to our needs in a way that we might not actually have been used to, when the real constraint was how small can we get it, how powerful can we get it. So now that we are the parameter, I think there might actually be a totally new horizon opening up in terms of the psychological affect of our devices.
Yeah, one of the things we thought about while creating the exhibition is that the more complicated technology we are approaching, like, years ago we had only the bicycle and we knew how to, mend it if something happens, but now we just get that washing machine and we don't even know how to operate it. And one of the things we kept on thinking was that the more technology becomes more complicated, we want our objects to be sometimes more human. We look for humanity in objects because it's black boxes all over and it's too complicated to understand. So we need that need of connecting to making our objects human.
Yeah. And here might be a good moment to say that one conclusion you shouldn't take from the pig story is that our overall material intelligence across all humankind has declined, because that's obviously not true, because look around you at what we're able to do. What's happened rather is that it's become much more specialized and focused, so that people in different domains of material intelligence, craftspeople, engineers, scientists, etc., are not integrated into one community the way that they arguably were in the 18th century, let's say. So that's really the transformation that I'm trying to describe. I think you're also right to say that objects need to be, somehow animated or turned into symbols of themselves. The obvious thing here would be like the Japanese tendency to make things so-called cute or kawaii as a way of giving people an opportunity to relate to them. And it's not a coincidence that Japan is the nation that generated that aesthetic first, because they, of course, were also really the leading electronics producing nation in the 20th century. So the one arguably produced the other, which is a good demonstration of the theme that you're raising. And it's fascinating to look at an object like this fan, because I suppose for most people now you look at that and think, boy, that looks dangerous, because you can't not imagine putting your hand in there, right? And that's another aspect of this conversation, that the objects around us are being more and more subjected to health and safety measures and other regulatory systems that in a way kind of smooth out their rough edges and take away a lot of their personality. The great example of this would of course be automobiles, which used to be a wonderfully diverse domain of design. And now of course all the cars look the same because they're pushed into that shape by the health and safety regulations that we have, maybe for good reason, but that's another reason that we've lost the diversity of the objects around us, arguably. And I know we'll get onto an Israeli automotive design story in a second, but that's just one example.
Yeah.
Many others.
Yeah. Let's move another step forward and talk about domestication. Well, you see this image already. We know our role in domesticating nature, but we all know that nature domesticates us as well. We design objects, but at the same time, maybe objects design us. What do you think? Is there a way that you can see how objects design us?
Yeah, for sure. There's a great theorist who's written about this a lot called Bruno Latour, French theorist, and he has this he calls it an actor network theory, which sounds a little complicated, but what he's talking about, at least as far as relevant to what you've just asked, is that
we were talking about him while creating the exhibition a lot.
Oh, you were? Great. Okay, so the idea is that the specific designs of an object basically have agency, or what you might as well think of as agency. So even though they're not subjective, in other words, they don't see and think and feel, have emotions, they actually exert force on things around them. And he has a wonderful example of this, which is the big fob that you have on the end of a hotel key. And now this is kind of going away because we have these electronic cards instead. But if you go to a traditional hotel, you might still get a key with this big old thing that you can't fit in your pocket. And the point of it is, of course, is that you don't lose the key, or you
don't steal it.
Yeah, probably people aren't so worried about stealing it as just putting it in your pocket and going to the next city, right, by mistake, and then, oh no, I still have the hotel key. And the physical design of the fob prevents that. And that's a very obvious example. But what Latour says is that our entire material environment works that way, that there are forms of that kind of agency, is the word that he uses, that exert that kind of pressure on all of our activities in ways that we're hardly even aware of. It's a really nice way of thinking about material culture.
Yeah. I want to show you another image, this one. Whenever I take visitors around the exhibition, the first thing they see in this image is the pig of Marcel Wonders. But in our exhibition, the object is part of the category called invisible objects. Objects that are not included in books dedicated to the collection and do not receive a catalog number. I'm not talking about the Marcel Wonders piggy bank, of course, but about the material that surrounds it. A pillow that adapts itself to the object requiring special protection. In our exhibition, we decided to put those unworthy objects on pedestals. As you know, museums decide what is worthy and unworthy to present. If you wanted to correct this injustice, what would you put on a pedestal?
Yeah, I think there's two ways of thinking about that question. One of which is maybe more suggested by the image would be, and this would actually be really amazing, to put together a museum or an exhibition of things to be destroyed. So it like an anti-museum where instead of presenting things as exemplary, you were presenting them as almost like, you know, cursed objects to be banished in some way, and then maybe allow the audience to come in at a certain stage and do this. It sounds like more like an art project than a than a serious curatorial proposal. And in fact, there was an artist called Michael Landy who did this absolutely amazing project back in the 90s, I think this was, where he he fed every single object that he owned except for what he was wearing into like a shredder on a big conveyor belt.
Wow.
So when he was done with the project, there was nothing left of his belongings, and it was like a clean start. So that kind of negative, sort of destructive act can actually be very poetic and powerful. Another way of answering the question, though, would be to think about objects that don't normally get attention in museums and should. So it's the reverse. And I've actually done this a couple of times. You know, because if you're thinking about material culture and craft, you're often thinking about neglected expertise and skills that don't have the light shine on them and should. So one example would be that when I was at the Museum of Arts and Design, we displayed a crate.
Yeah, I remember that.
With its object still inside it. It was a Wendell Castle table, the great designer, American designer. But the label and the interpretation was about the crate that had been made to house this extremely eccentric object. And the crate was amazing. You know, it was arguably every bit as impressive a piece of craftsmanship as the table in a different way. But obviously you would never normally see that being given credit in a museum. So that's a kind of, oh, there's my dog. But that's the kind of sort of reinvention that I think museum curators should be thinking about. Where are the stories that have not been told?
Yeah, that's for sure. When we curated Black Box exhibition, I will show you a little bit of some pictures from the exhibition. We thought that we will be able to let the objects tell their own story without interfering too much, without regimenting them at all. You can see here the lower gallery in the museum. In this part, we explore the collection of the museum, the essence of the collection museum through its value, composition, and uneven relations. In the upper gallery, which you see here, we track the history of events, structuring the relations between people and objects by dividing the space into categories. You see them here on the wall. When I look at the result of what we have done, it is far from the chaotic nature of the cabinet of wonders of the Renaissance. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think museums can create knowledge without regimenting and cataloging? Because that's where easy for us to go there, and how do we do it differently?
Yeah. So this is a fantastic question, and it makes me think about the number of times that I've heard people use the phrase cabinet of curiosities to describe what they're trying to do. And I often wonder, I mean, I know you do, but I often wonder how much they really know about historical cabinets of curiosities, because often the phrase is used to imply randomness, just a bunch of stuff thrown into a room any old way. But if you study 17th century cabinets of curiosity, what you realize is that they did have organizational systems. They were just really different from the organizational systems we would use today. You know, they were much more perhaps opportunistic or sensory or based on size or other ephemeral issues like smell or the idea of the four elements, so things that were associated with earth, air, fire, and water, which of course would be no longer clear to us. So I think that kind of arbitrariness that people sometimes mean by the phrase has actually never been part of museology, even at that point of its origin. And I think I would go so far as saying this, I might exaggerate here a little for effect, but I would go so far as saying that organizing objects into an intelligible form, in other words, making them readable as a certain arrangement, actually is the function of a museum, the central function of a museum, even more than storage and care of collections. You know, that obviously the etymological root of the word for curator in English is to care, right? The Latin curare, to care for. But obviously there's lots of museums that don't even have collections, you know, Kunsthalles in Germany. We think of those as museums, of course. And so I think that actually what museums are doing is much more like editing or orchestrating knowledge and objects in such a way that they can create new forms of meaning. I think of them as meaning machines. So my argument, I guess, would be that kind of arbitrariness that some people might associate with the idea of the Kunstkammer, the Cabinet of Curiosities, is not only unattainable, but probably not desirable either. Because what you really want from an exhibition is for it to show you the world again in a way that you never thought of it. And that ultimately at core is a matter of arrangement, matter of juxtaposition. That's the key art of curating, is to put things together in a way that they make a new kind of sense.
Yeah. You know, when you talk about it, I think about the Wes Anderson exhibition that he did in Vienna. And he did put things in order, like in the Cabinet of Curiosities, but the way he did put them in order wasn't the regular way. It wasn't a very didactic way of putting things in order, but still you could learn a lot about the objects through the way he divided them. And I think that's a very interesting way of teaching or creating knowledge without being very didactic, because I remember that part in which he did all those portraits of hairy people together, and or that part that the category is things made out of wood, while they were very different from each other. So there is a way of creating knowledge in a different way that is not the expected way.
Yeah. And it can also be very controversial, as we're currently seeing with the Victoria and Albert Museum's reorganization. And I don't know how much people in Israel know about this, but it's been, extremely, it's like a firestorm of controversy around this restructuring, because they're going away from a materials-based organization of the departments, and instead they're taking up a more conventional chronological and geographical structure of, medieval and Renaissance, and then 18th and 19th century and 20th, 21st century, and so on. And the argument has been that even if the galleries stay the same, if the curators organize themselves differently, no longer thinking that material is the principle that they're using to essentially structure their own internal communications, then you're going to have a big shift in what the museum actually ends up being. So it's a very interesting conversation. As a material intelligence advocate, and former V&A staff member, I'm sort of sad to see that material structure going away. And I think something is really lost there. So how you cut the world up and divide it, what cross-section you draw through it, is decisive in museums. I think everything else flows from that set of decisions.
Wow, who is leading the way for changing the V&A now? I didn't hear about that. Is it the new management?
Yeah, the director now is Tristram Hunt, who actually came out of government. He was an MP, Labor MP originally. And, I have to say, in general, I've been very in favor of him. I think he's done a great job under difficult circumstances. Obviously, for any museum, I'm sure Holon included, the last year has been a big challenge. I guess the question would be whether this is really the time to undertake a huge restructuring, and also whether that's the right way to be going. So, but big topic. but the key thing is that the way that museums organize themselves tends to mirror the way that they organize the world, and it's very difficult to think outside of that.
Yeah. Well, my last image and then I will let you show maybe some of yours if you have. My last image is the Susita, a car built in Israel at 1959. It started as a source of pride, represented the ideals of the years during which it was manufactured, local Jewish labor and the Jewish power of invention, using fiberglass instead of tin. Over the years, changes in our society and the decline of fiberglass in the local arena almost destroyed the Susita reputation. I know you just published a book about design in America. Can you think of an example that resembles the case of our Susita or other examples?
Yeah. Well, there's an obvious one, which is the Edsel, which was named for Henry Ford's son, Edsel Ford, who was coming into leadership of the company. And that was a famous disaster. Very much to the satisfaction of people that hated the Ford Motor Company, because it was very, high profile, and the car was a complete lemon, as we say here, so it didn't work properly, sold terribly, and the company lost a lot of money on it. I think it's a slightly different story from this because it doesn't have that national pride invested in it as the Susita did. But I think it points to the fact that design failure is just as interesting as design success, and you can often read just as much from it. And I think that failure is probably an understudied phenomenon in design history and art history too. I think you probably could learn a lot about artists from what they don't let out of the studio. And obviously that doesn't tend to be something artists want to focus on, but seeing the kind of reverse image of successful creativity, I think can tell you a lot. And then of course there's this other topic, which is just in a more general sense, what do nationalism and design have to do with one another? And you could argue that our automotive industry has had even more kind of chauvinistic, patriotic energy invested in it than could have been possible in Israel. In some ways, the auto industry has been the paradigm case of design in America. It's the first category that you go to in a way, and it's just very interesting to think about what that has meant, particularly over the last 20 years. As I already said, you have a general degradation of the design diversity in the auto industry, and then at the same time you have this kind of tipping away from cultures of risk and adventure, which are often very macho, of course, very masculine, and more towards this culture of safety. And now we're going even a step further towards cars that drive themselves, and thinking about cars as basically extensions of our living room rather than discrete active spaces of exploration or control, so another kind of passive situation perhaps for our bodies. And what will that mean? People talk a lot about what that will mean for society and as a technology. I don't hear people talk very much about what it would mean for America, but I think America is so bound up, like our sense of ourselves as a country is so bound up with the auto industry, that if cars themselves become these silent, gliding, innocuous mechanisms in an integrated artificial intelligence controlled system, I think that would change America's sense of itself in ways that we can't even imagine, frankly, not just because of what's on the ground, but also because of the symbolic register of what the car means here. So I'm very interested in thinking about those questions at the moment.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your last book? Is it
Sure.
your last book, Design in America? Is it the name of the book?
Actually, I'll put an image up on the screen if you don't mind. If you stop sharing, we can share instead. So it's called Craft and American History. And the idea of the book is to really tell the story of the United States through the eyes of its artisans. So the concept here would be to not so much think about a mainstream story about decorative arts, ceramics, textiles, furniture, like we would often do in an American museum, but instead to place the people themselves at the center of the story of America. So obviously that's a story about race, a story about class, a story about gender, a story about immigrants and native born people, story about Native Americans. So I'll just show you this one comparison. Obviously these are the two images from the cover, you see. So that's a very, very famous painting on the left, famous in this country. It's Paul Revere, the revolutionary hero and silversmith, painted by John Singleton Copley. And then on the right, you have a quilt that was made in 1983 by a woman named Jessie Telfair. And she had been a very active participant in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And the reason I put these two images on the cover is that they in some way mark the extremes of the book's contents. You know, one the 18th century, the other late 20th century, so almost at the present day. You have a white man and a black woman. You have a guy from Boston up in the north. You have a woman from the south. You have silversmith. You have a textile artist. So there's a lot of range here. But then there's also this fascinating thing that they have in common, which is that they were both activists and both, in fact, revolutionaries in some sense. So the American Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement. And in fact, the word that Jessie Telfair is repeating on her quilt 7 times, almost like a chant. You know, you can imagine civil rights marchers going through the streets of Birmingham, Alabama with Martin Luther King chanting freedom. That, of course, was exactly the same word that the revolutionary generation of the late 18th century used as an explanation of what they wanted and why they wanted independence from Britain. So it's fascinating just to think about the persistence of some of the rhetoric around the idea of independence and the way that craft informs that conversation. Often, of course, craft is seen as the very means by which that independence or autonomy can be secured. Because if you have the ability to support yourself through a craft, then you don't have dependency on anybody else. That's the idea. Of course, the actuality is a little more complicated. And again, when you introduce issues like gender and race into the equation, then it gets even more complicated. And that's really the story or the set of stories that I try to tell in the book. So I don't actually know if you can buy it in Israel yet. I know it's coming out in the UK in April, but presumably at some point in this year, people will be able to get a hold of a copy if they're interested.
Great. We are looking forward to reading it. Thank you very much, Glenn. It was very interesting. It was amazing. I don't think we have questions, do we?
Not yet, but we can ask. If anybody wants to ask something on the Q&A section, now is the time.
Yeah, there is one.
There's a comment.
An encouraging comment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll take those, that's for sure.
Thank you. Okay.
Can I ask you a question, Maya?
Yeah, sure.
Do you think of the exhibition as taking the design museum in a new direction in some ways? Like, does it represent a future trajectory for the institution? Are you exploring these themes because of a broader set of intellectual interests that represents a kind of new phase in the museum's development?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think I know this exhibition is an exhibition I wanted to do for a long time, and thanks to the corona, I was able to do it just in the last year. We were able to create it. It was an exhibition that we decided it is going to be based on our collection and on our stuff, not to rely on objects coming from outside, even though some of the objects doesn't belong to the collection. But what happened is that when we looked at our collection, we thought that we don't have enough objects that are mass-produced objects. We have a lot of design art objects in our collection. Our collection is eclectic, as any other museum's eclectic collection. We started the collection when the museum was opened. We didn't have a collection before that, and we realized there is that we are lacking a lot of industrial design objects. So the exhibition was the opportunity to invite or to collect objects, and now we have them in our collection. Like we have a telephone booth that we didn't have before. We have all kinds of objects that were Israeli inventions even, but we didn't have them in our collection. So this exhibition is very special for me and for the museum, because it's dealing with all kinds of questions we didn't deal before. I don't know if we are going to go on. I do hope to go on this direction and go on asking those questions, and maybe later on having them answered in a different way in another exhibition.
Fascinating. I think it's been, in a funny way, it's a good year to do these things, because we've all been required to take a step back from our usual habits. So maybe that's true for institutions as well. I guess I might just say one thing about that, Maya, and I don't know how many curators we have in the audience, but I do think of design curating as one of the most challenging areas of museum practice. And maybe it's easy for me to think about it that way because I'm a design curator, but I think it has a particular feature that other kinds of curators don't need to worry about, because we never know whether what we're trying to do is show people the exceptional or the typical. If you see what I mean? Because the problem is that if you show the exceptional, then you feel that you're not really touching people's real lives and how design intersects with them. But if you show them the typical, then they say to themselves rightly, well, I have that at home, or my grandmother had it at home. And maybe the best you can do is show them something old and typical, but then you're kind of a history museum, not a design museum, if that's your only basis to make choices. So for me, what it means is that as a design museum, you need to come up with a unique perspective on the topic before you can even start, because you otherwise don't know why you would collect something. And I don't think that really comes up in other museums so much. You know, art museums, they generally think, okay, we're collecting art and we're taking the narrative that comes to us from art history and from artists. But design museums don't necessarily think that they're replicating the narratives that are created by companies. Quite the contrary, because they might want to be very critical and stand outside that. Or similarly, a natural history museum curator might think, well, I have to get examples of all the birds, like specimens of all the birds, so I can study them. But what would be the point of doing that at a design museum? Get all the toasters? You know, why would, I mean, it's impossible anyway, but why would you do it? And what do you think you would learn from that, you know, even if you could do it? So it just means that all of the obvious intellectual templates for collection formation, and therefore everything else, because so much comes from the collection, as we were saying earlier, is really up for grabs in a way, and politicized right from the beginning in a way that I think is very unusual in museums. And it's really interesting to hear that Holon is sort of confronting that right now. I think every design museum has to confront it, whether they realize it or not.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting in that angle, from that angle, because I see that every exhibition that we are presenting is completely different from the other, and I feel privileged that we can do all kinds of exhibitions that are so different from each other, because we are like tackling the idea of design from different angles, and in that way we don't come with set answers. It's like, if I think about the exhibition of Extreme that we had before, it was about critical design, and it had a lot of design art, but it is time to deal with questions about the typical, as you said, and because it's we cannot, as a design museum, only show the extraordinary or the design art. because curatorship is about the context that you put things in. And I think what really we did in this exhibition is show that there are many narratives we can tell, many stories about ordinary objects.
Hey Maya, I noticed we have a couple of questions we could answer.
Okay.
The first question is from Guy Kuningstein, which is also part of the exhibition. He did a soundtrack work for the exhibition. And Maya, he asked you what are the categories that we used in the exhibition, and then he asked Glenn what would be his categories if he would to do this same exhibition.
Glenn, you answer first.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking if somebody handed me the design museum in Holon, what would I do? Which is sort of in a way what Guy is asking. I mean, it's so dependent on the moment too. Like you're describing the trajectory of the institution in a really interesting way, and sort of tackling this question of, you know, what objects do for us seems like a very relevant question for you to be asking at the moment. I think for me, coming from a totally different context, to be totally honest, I think what I would do now if somebody just gave me a design museum and said you can organize this however you want, is I would probably organize it by political problem. Because I think if you're in America right now, boy, it's hard to think about anything else, or at any rate, you have to think about it first, because we're very rightly having a reckoning with ourselves about a lot of repressed, ugly truths. I mean, maybe in Israel you're having a version of this, I don't know. But certainly,
yeah, we do, for sure.
But certainly in America, a lot of that is about race. It continues to be about questions of religion, guns, sexual orientation, our relationship to the rest of the world. And I think it would be amazing to organize a museum like that. Like, there's a gallery about racism and racial liberation and equality. There's a gallery about xenophobia and nationalism. There's a gallery about gender prejudice. You know, I think I would do it that way right now. Hopefully in 10 years that wouldn't seem so necessary, but right now I think it would be helpful.
Wow. Okay, to go back to Guy question, I have it in front of me because my head started, you know, melting. The first category is encounter, then we have connection, domestication, unification, mechanization, and conversion is the last one. That's in the upper gallery. In the lower gallery, we have different categories like the troublemakers, invisible objects that I talked about them, odd ones out, sublime objects, that's the design art, of course, and left behind we have a wonderful film made by Scan the City that we see the objects left in the collection room. So those are the categories.
Yeah, because you see a certain commonality there, but also a certain unpredictability. That can be a very nice way to organize things too. It's like, you know, every chapter of the book doesn't need to be set up on the same logic, you know.
Do we have another question?
Yes, from Noam Dover. You think that design museum should be about exhibition material knowledge? How can knowledge, techniques, methods be addressed in an exhibition?
I might say something about that if it's okay, Maya.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, when I was the director at the Museum of Arts and Design, that was really what I wanted the museum to do. I used to say, I want this to be a museum of making, because the Museum of Arts and Design had roots as a craft museum, in fact, the first American craft museum. So we thought about this a lot. And I think the answer turns out to be there are lots of ways, and they kind of fit together in a really fascinating palette, like colors on a painting. So just some of them would be showing an incomplete object, or an object that's actually fallen apart, or an object upside down, or an object that's still in the stage of being a prototype. So in other words, objects that are not their final polished perfect version, but in some way are at a different stage in their life cycle. Obviously, film is very, very useful, but also sound. Sound can be incredibly evocative and as a kind of soundtrack for an exhibition. Just the kind of psychological presence of the sound of making can be really, really effective. There's actually a really lovely story about that. There's a famous American artist called Robert Morris who made a piece called A Box with the Sound of Its Own Making in 1961. So it's just a wooden box and it has a tape recorder inside that plays the recording of the making of the box. And the good story is that when John Cage, the composer, came over to Morris's studio and he had just finished the box, Cage said, "Oh, I'd love to hear it." And Morris said, "Sure." And he set it up and got it playing and stood back. And Cage just sat down and listened to the entire thing, which is like 3 hours long of sawing and hammering.
Wow.
And Morris realized, well, this is John Cage, of course. And so he sort of left him alone. And at the end, John Cage said to Morris, "Thank you, that was very enjoyable." So he really got a lot out of that. But anyway, it's just to say that there's lots of different ways of bringing making to the museum. Obviously, if it's safe, you could bring actual makers and have demonstrations in the galleries. You can show tools. You can show, raw materials in relationship to the finished object. There's lots and lots of things that you can do. And I think it's a very underexploited set of techniques in design museums. It's actually seen more often in technology museums. In fact, that's where you would see a lot of these techniques being explored, like kids museums and science and technology museums. So there's a lot to learn from that sphere.
Great. Glenn, thank you very much. I think it's about time for us to end the conversation, and we don't have any more questions. I do hope somebody will build that political museum. I'll come and work there with you.
Great.
Thank you very much. That was amazing. And have a good evening.
You too. Just really nice to be with you all. And I hope everyone stays safe over there. It's been great to have the time.
Thank you. And thank you all the audiences. We're having holidays soon. So Chag Sameach.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thanks for tuning in.
Chag Sameach.
Bye.
Bye.